Hello everybody, it's Silver. This is Monomyth. So when I first saw this, I thought, oh hey, like a sort of cool indie dungeon crawler, and I was definitely into that. But then when I played it, I got something I didn't expect, which was Arx Fatalis. Because this game is very heavily inspired by games like that. And if you've never played Arx, it was a really awesome 2002 RPG that was made by Arcane, actually the people that would go on to make games like Dishonored. But Arx was a really immersive and interesting RPG. It unfortunately got kind of overshadowed by Morrowind, which also released very shortly afterwards, but it was very different from any of those games and was more heavily inspired by Ultima Underworld 2. But overall, it was a game that's never really been replicated. Very few games have ever tried to have a similar style to that. I would say that something like Dark Messiah of Might and Magic is probably one of those games, but even that is still very different. And you can tell you're in for something good when you're creating your character in this game, and you have a lot of different skills to choose from as to what they can do. Everything from different kinds of weapon skills like swords and axes or blunt weapons to your usual stuff that you would probably want to splash into at least a little bit, like lockpicking. And then 3 different magic skills and several other things besides that. So there's definitely going to be a lot of variety here in terms of character builds, and even in the current early access state, there's quite a bit of stuff to find and do, and I was actually really impressed with the amount of content on offer here already. It's, in its earlier state, but they've clearly waited until they had a pretty substantial amount of game to show before they put it into the early access campaign. So the way that it works is there are these big open hub areas, and then there are some side sort of dungeons and other areas like that are separated by loading screens usually. And then there's going to be a sort of a bigger loading screen that leads to the next big hub open area. So it's not one contiguous open world, but rather some smaller but still very substantial ones. And at the current state of the game, there are 2 of these large hub open world areas. And when I say large, I really do mean it. They're really big. And once you pass the initial loading screen to get to them, you won't have one for a long time because there's a lot to find and discover in them, as well as, of course, lots of side quests and side dungeons and a ton of secrets and things. And while playing, you can't expect the game to hold your hand. This is one of those very old-school inspired dungeon crawlers, which means it's going to tell you roughly where you're expected to go, but you're not going to get like a map with a big quest marker on it or anything, so you're going to have to find your way there yourself. There are maps that you can find for the big areas in this game, and you'll usually find them pretty early on, as long as you're looking to make sure that you have them for most of your exploration. You're not going to go a long time without one of these maps usually, but these maps are kind of rudimentary, deliberately so. They have a really cool hand-drawn look to them, and they are not super detailed topographically, by which I mean they don't show you how each area leads into the next area. They're more like a sort of basic top-down shape of things kind of map, so they're not going to give you the details about how each of the areas connects and stuff, and you're just going to have to sort of figure it out yourself. This gives the game's exploration a very similar feel to Arx Fatalis. So that game had a similar idea, sort of a basic map, no quest markers, just explore and find everything that you can. And just like that game, this can be a little bit confusing to navigate at first because you are in a bunch of twisting underground tunnels for a lot of it. But also like Arx, once you figure out the routes and how the areas connect, this confusion is temporary. It might seem a little bit maze-like at first, but once you get used to how everything works, you'll be able to easily find your way from area to area. It just takes a little bit of time. Another similarity to Arx is the way that everything is very manual in this game in terms of how you handle it. So you can do things like cook food, and you simply do this by taking the food out of your inventory and plopping it on the ground next to a campfire or over a cooking fire or something like that, and you just wait for it to sizzle and cook and pick it back up, and there you go, you've got cooked food. So you can go fishing, pull out a bunch of fish, slap them next to a fire and wait for them to grill, and then you'll have an inventory full of grilled fish that you can use for healing. You can also do things like combining flour and water to make dough, and then use this dough to make bread or even pies, which is a bit more complicated and takes some more steps, but you can do it, which is pretty neat actually. And this also works for exploring and dungeon crawling, not just for cooking food and stuff. You may find, say, a broken lever, and then you'll later find a base for this lever to fit into, and you simply pick up the lever and slap it in the base, and there you go, you've repaired it, and now you can use it to open a door or whatever. And this also extends to how you manage your equipment, because your equipment has durability in this game, but it works a little bit different than how you might expect. Your weapons will degrade with use, especially if you're smacking like wooden or metal stuff like doors to break them down and things, but even just using them against enemies, they will degrade over time, and as they degrade, they'll do less and less damage. However, in order to fix them, you have to actually do it manually. So you'll find a forge and you'll plop the sword down in the forge and wait for it to heat up and start glowing orange, and then you'll grab a blacksmith's hammer, plop the weapon on an anvil, and smack it with a hammer about 8 or 9 times, and each time it will cool it down and improve its condition. And you can keep doing this all the way until it goes back to excellent condition, the best that it can be. This means that you don't have to worry about like a durability gauge exactly, it's just that it degrades over time and you can fill it back up using a forge and a hammer. You can also have shields and armor, and they do degrade as well. As far as I know right now, there is no method to repair those yourself. Instead, you have to go to a blacksmith and pay them to repair them. I don't know if they plan on adding like a leather working or any sort of skill like that in order to have you be able to repair them yourself. I don't know if that's planned, but as of right now, that's a more traditional video game style repair where you simply pay an NPC to do it for you. Another really cool mechanic that I've definitely enjoyed in this game is the magic, and this is kind of a big deal if you're inspired by Arx Fatalis, because that game had a really interesting magic system where you drew these runes with your mouse, and when you drew a specific sort of sentence of runes, it would call forth a specific spell, and you had to memorize what runes in what order create what spells. There are a ton of spells in that game, and it's just a really neat system, and it also rewards experimentation because you don't necessarily have to know the spells in advance, and instead you can draw the runes and see what you can create. And they've made a magic system in this game that is very clearly inspired by that one without being just the same thing again. It's actually quite different. So in this game, you have this sort of big pentagram that is your magic menu, and it has 10 of these empty slots on it. And you can find these things called echo stones that all have a sort of word like a rune that they represent, and they all slot into one of those specific areas on the pentagram. And you simply click them in a specific order to create sort of a phrase, and that is how you call forth a certain spell. And each spell has a specific phrase of these stones that you need in order to click in order to use it. But also, since they're on a pentagram, every phrase draws a shape along the pentagram itself, so you can either memorize the phrase of stones and how they're named, or the shape that it takes on the pentagram that you're drawing with your mouse. Either way, you have to do one of these things in order to call forth a spell. And this also rewards experimentation in the same way, because you don't have to know the spells in advance. You can just draw stuff randomly and see what happens, and you can come across new spells that way. You'll also find these glowing scrolls that will give you the specific recipe for each spell, but yeah, you can still find them just by experimenting. Casting them is also a bit unusual. You don't cast them with just your hand. Instead, you need an implement of some kind. I've found a book as well as an orb, and the orb is a bit more powerful, but they both allow you to call forth these spells. You put them in the book or in the orb, and you can put several of them in there at once and use your mouse wheel to scroll between the ones you have, and the little sort of logo of the spell will show up on the book page or in the middle of the orb to show you which one you have selected, and then you can cast it by holding that item and then holding the mouse button down. You also have, you've got an MP gauge, so casting spells does cost MP, and it doesn't really regenerate on its own, so you'll need to, say, grill mushrooms or find MP potions and things like that in order to refill it. But you've also got a bit of an interesting system in the form of focus. It's basically a stamina gauge that only appears while casting. So you do have a stamina gauge that works like normal. It reduces when you sprint, when you swing your weapon, when you dodge back and forth, stuff like that, and you've got to manage your stamina during combat to make sure you don't run out and get smacked in the face with something. But you also have this focus gauge that only appears while you're casting, and it reduces depending on the spell you're using. The description of each spell will tell you how much focus it takes, roughly. And once this runs out, then you simply can't cast, even if you do have the MP for it. So this means the magic system in the game is not like a spammable magic, since they all cost this focus resource as well as your MP, and you have to do a very similar dance with a stamina gauge that you would with melee combat, except it's a separate gauge. It also does seem to reduce when you take damage as well, which kind of makes sense, right? It's hard to focus when someone is shoving a dagger into your ribcage, so as you take damage, it will reduce your focus focus and make you less likely to be able to cast spells. Melee combat is relatively basic, but it does the job. I would definitely like to see it expanded a little bit with more capabilities, more moves, more advanced stuff you can do, possibly in the future of the early access campaign. But as it stands right now, it still works just fine. You have a series of normal swings for whatever weapon you're using, as well as a power attack that you can charge up. It costs more stamina and takes a minute to charge, but does a lot of extra damage. You can also dash back and forth using the jump button while in combat in order to sort of avoid attacks, but it takes a lot of stamina to do this, so you've got to be careful with it. You can also block with a weapon or with a shield if you happen to be equipped with a shield. I don't know if there's like a parry system in terms of timing blocks just right, but I have noticed that it does seem to matter when you lift your shield versus when the attack is coming in. It does seem like if you do it kind of right before you get hit, that you're more likely to sort of deflect the enemy. There is also a kick in the game, but I haven't really found it all that useful because it often misses or otherwise just doesn't really do much. While you're exploring around, you'll find these altar thingies that have a sort of chalice on them and a bunch of golden writing on them, and these are your checkpoints. You can rest at any of them to completely restore your HP and MP, and you can also use them to level up, because completing quests and killing enemies gives you experience, and once you have enough, you'll level up, and every level will give you 1 stat point, so you can increase things like your strength or intelligence and stuff like that, that all of your other capabilities are derived from those stats, and you can also get 2 skill points that you can use to increase your skills, like the aforementioned magic skills or lockpicking or weapon-based skills and things of that nature. There is also a tiny little bit of a Souls-like element in here in the way that, first off, there's these checkpoint areas that are kind of like bonfires, but also when you die, you actually drop about half of your experience in the sort of ghostly green flame that stays where you died. And if you're able to get back to it and poke it, then you get your experience back. I've also noticed that I don't think it disappears if you die multiple times on the way back to it. They all seem to stay there permanently, so you never really fully lose this experience. You can always go back and get it. However, this does not happen if you don't have one of those shrines found in an area. If you're new to an area and you haven't found one of those checkpoints yet and you die, then that's it, game over, you've got to reload. You do have a really nice grid-based inventory that you can use to store everything, as well as lots of equipment slots to equip various stuff. You can also find backpacks and usually really well-hidden secrets or for a lot of money at certain vendors, and these will give you entire new pages of inventory, so they're very much worth it. Exploration-wise, not only are the areas large, but they're also completely packed full of stuff to find. You will basically never find an empty area that does nothing. Very rarely, if ever, have I wandered into a place that seemed like it could be important, but had nothing to do. It might have seemed like it was nothing, but later on a quest would lead me there or something. It seems like there's always something to find. I even made it up to certain areas that I figured that I wasn't supposed to get up to, but I was just exploring to see what was up there. And there was actually loot up there, so the developer thought of that and actually put stuff up there, so you actually are meant to get up. And this is helped by the fact that there is a very useful item called a harpy root that you can find that allows you to jump like double the height, so you can use this to get up to areas that you otherwise couldn't previously. There's also an absolute ton of secrets hidden all around the place, just like Arx. If you're exploring every corner in the dark, then you'll find all sorts of items and chests and stuff that's hidden around the place for you to get, as well as difficult to get to areas or areas that are right in front of you but are blocked off in some way, and you've got to figure out how to unblock them or get to them. There can be hidden levers and switches and buttons all over the place. There can be things that you've got to blast with explosive barrels to get through, doors that you've got to lockpick. You can even do things like break down certain doors if you don't want to lockpick them or can't. As long as they're not metal, those you have to either blast or pick. And you can also even crouch down and look through the keyholes on doors to see what's on the other side, to see if you think it might be worth using a lockpick or not. There's just a ton to explore, and the quests also help you with this. You've got a series of main quests that will lead you throughout the underground and eventually up to the surface of this area, and those are kind of open main quests, by which I mean a lot of them have a goal that isn't super specific. It's just like find this person wherever they are, or go to this area and figure out what's going on there. They're very like open-ended sort of quests, so you have usually several other sub-objectives to complete before you can actually get to whatever it is that it's talking about. But then there are also lots of side quests, and the side quests in this game are very much worth doing. Talk to every NPC, because several of them will have side quests for you to do. They will give you a good chunk of experience when you complete them, and also usually some money or other items, some of which you can't get easily otherwise. So they make these side quests super worth it. So I guess all this kind of begs the question, is Monomyth an immersive sim? Well, kind of, yes. If you're the sort of person that felt that Arx Fatalis was one of those, then this will also qualify for the same exact reasons, even if slightly less so because there are still some mechanics to be added as the game develops through early access. But even as it currently stands, I'd say it does technically qualify, although your mileage may vary because that's such a nebulous term that barely has a specific definition in the first place that it's kind of up to you. But I do think personally that it does qualify. It has enough of that interesting world manipulation and multiple ways around your problems that it does sort of meet the requirements, I guess. Overall, I think Monomyth is a mechanically rich game that's going for a bygone style of open world RPG that we just don't see anymore, and honestly, even back in its day, we barely saw very many of. It was never really replicated, so seeing it like this is super cool, and I'm glad to see someone being inspired by those classic games that were really, really fun for specific and interesting reasons that were not easily replicated later. You know, this is a style of game that isn't really made anymore for the most part, and that's kind of a shame. So it's really cool to see someone doing it so well and understanding down to like the bones of the mechanics why those games were interesting. I would say currently for the amount that it's asking and for the amount of content that it has and the amount of polish that the content has, it's very well worth the asking price. And I expect that they're not going to change the price until it launches, basically. So it's going to continue to get better and better in terms of value prospect as it develops until it finally goes to 1.0. So if you miss this really fun style of RPG, or if you've never played one and would like to go back and enjoy a sort of style of RPG that isn't made anymore, but with some more modern conveniences and things without taking away some of that hardcore strangeness that these games actually had for you to experience, then yeah, definitely recommend Monomyth. I will be keeping a close eye on this because I think it's a super cool project and it's being made with a lot of love and passion for something we just don't see anymore. So thank you guys very much for watching. I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Monomyth if you wish to check it out yourselves. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.